All right, let's go ahead. We'll get to the next slide here, do a couple of intros. So hey everybody, I'm Stan Kinney, VP of Tallan's Cloud Solutions practice, which includes our security division. And with me, I also have Mark Jacquard. Mark, if you want to say hi. He's a Tallan architect. And Brandon, if you want to give a little intro on yourself.
Sure thing. Hi, guys. This is Brandon Cox with SecureSky. So I'm the Director of Product Architecture. I work on our proprietary cloud security posture management platform, as well as our Sentinel implementation practice.
Awesome. Thanks, Brandon. So we want to go to the next slide here. I'm going to do, I've got one slide to present, and then I'm going to turn it over to Brandon here for the majority of the presentation. But I wanted to take a minute first, and first of all, welcome everybody for taking some time out of your busy day. I know everybody's busy, so we really appreciate taking the time to learn a little bit about how Tallan and SecureSky have partnered up to help a lot of our customers on the Microsoft stack, providing that, really building and maturing their security platforms. And I think it's especially just from the attendance today, looks very well. And I think it's just one of those things where, the cyber threats are intense. They're growing, they're, being very sophisticated. And with that, I think companies, as well as they should be, are very concerned these days, right? And so with that, we've worked with probably about 20 customers since January doing security assessments. And that's just a way for us to kind of come in and say, hey, where are you at in your maturity level in terms of your security posture, right? And how can we help you further that along, whether it's through tools, whether that's through services or education. How do we educate you? Because there's a lot of different tools out there. There's a lot of different components. So having a partner a lot of times can help you build that roadmap. And that's really what we're trying to do. During those 20 assessments, we found that, some pretty interesting statistics. For example, 9 million DLP or data loss prevention risk or instances out there. We also saw the Azure policy was normally on average only about 22% compliant. So a lot of things to address and a lot of things to help our customers with the tools that a lot of times they already have, right? And I think that's the kind of the beauty of it. With that, we based it on the Zero Trust framework. And one of the things that we found is we really wanted to partner up with SecureSky to really offer a complete portfolio or a 365-degree of security services. So using that along with Microsoft's technology stack, we can do things like education. Example, this first bullet here, cloud adoption framework. We feel like that's kind of the bedrock or the framework. Security workshops, right? It's all about education. Detailed security configuration and those control assessments is something else. And then implementing like things like a SIEM, right? Microsoft Sentinel and XDR suite deployment and enablement services. And then especially where SecureSky has really completed that security portfolio is the Microsoft Sentinel managed detection and response, or the MDR services. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brandon because he's going to get into a lot of these things. And stick around to the end because we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the overall process there, give you a little bit more understanding of operational how to do it. And then also we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So Brandon, I'll let you take it from here.
Perfect. Thanks, Stan. Thanks, Tallan, for partnering with us on this webinar. And thank you all for sticking with us here for the hour and listening to Stan, Mark, and I get a whole bunch of knowledge out to you guys. So we've got just a couple pieces here for the agenda. I'm going to start by just going through some of the market presence that Microsoft has now in the security space. So we'll talk a little bit about Microsoft's security stack as it kind of reaches into their different cloud platforms, whether it be Microsoft 365, Azure Defender for Endpoint with some of the endpoint detection and response, and then we'll hit Sentinel itself being, one of the newer products that's out in the market. We'll talk a little bit about their space. We have been privileged enough to work with Forrester and Gartner in previous lives in different waves and magic quadrants, and so give a little bit of insight into how that works really, why they're positioned where they are, and what you can kind of expect to see, going forward, just based on how we see their trajectory. And then gonna finish up the market piece with some of the operational components of we adopted Sentinel as our major SIEM, both for ourselves as well as for our customers and the customers that we partner with Tallan on. So what did we look for when we were actually adopting a SIEM? What's the operational point of view that we wanted to really hit home with? And then I'm going to switch gears at the very end there and just talk technical chops, talk some of the demo. We've got just a couple pieces that we feel are really differentiators when it comes to Sentinel, both from just an analyst point of view, how I would be able to interact with incidents and ask the common questions, down to what if I wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning because I have an incident, but it takes me a long time to get logged in and actually see something in there. How can I just be fed this information? What are the avenues for me to just react to something in Sentinel without even needing to get my laptop out? And then we'll kind of finish up with some of the cost avenues, just because Sentinel is a completely consumption-based model. And so based on how you're ingesting the data, based on how you're storing the data and where you're storing the data, there's a pretty big factor of money and cost in there as well. So we'll share a little bit of insight on where we can actually help save some costs, where Sentinel, you can still retain a lot of data and then only really use it when you need to. And that winds up being a pretty big cost savings aspect there. And then, yes, like Stan had mentioned, I promise I will save time at the end here for any questions. Feel free to send them in the chat, and we'll respond to them as we can. Otherwise, if it looks like it's going to be more of a dialogue, we'll save it towards the end, and we'll just go through those Q&A. I feel like it's fair to start here, though, by just having a quick definitions table. There's a whole lot of acronyms that are thrown around in the security space now, and everybody does a really good job of just adding to that acronym pile. And so the four major ones that we wanted to make sure that we called out here are endpoint detection and response, security information and event management, security orchestration, automation and response, and then extended detection and response. So if I start with endpoint detection and response, an EDR product, and it is a product that you purchase from a company, and it basically is a product that deploys on workstations, desktops, things of that nature, endpoints that users use, and it's capable of monitoring, detecting anomalies, and then automatically responding to threats. There are white papers, there are research papers that will give you a lot more information into that definition and what's good, what's bad about it, and everything like that. But if we were to just summarize it in one line, that's pretty much what the entirety of an EDR is designed to do. The concept of why or how it does is a lot of different functions, and it's a lot of different ways that it can do that, whether it be the antivirus module, whether it be the behavior module, or anything like that. And every single EDR product that you go to evaluate is going to be just a little bit different in how it works. But that's kind of just a very quick summary in what an EDR product is designed to do. If you then look at a SIEM is, once again, it's another product. It's a product that you purchase that is capable of consolidating data, especially log data, from all of the different products, mostly security products, in your environment. And it is primarily designed to perform security analytics across all of those security products. It is going to provide a detection and alerting module that's going to either notify you of some sort of incident, it's going to notify you of something bad that's happening, and it's going to give you an incident management or ticket management view or portal. That's kind of once again, the basis of what a SIEM was designed to do. Once again, there's a lot of other modules in there where you want to talk about reporting generation, you want to talk about dashboarding, or any of those other concepts. Those are all additional modules that a SIEM can have. Not all SIEMs do have them. So if you just bubble it down to that one line, really looking at that log consolidation, looking for the bad things by being able to query and detect across all of my security products logs. SOAR, then, Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response, gives me a way, and it's usually a bolt-on to a SIEM now. There are standalone SOAR products, but most of them are going to just bolt on to a SIEM. SOAR gives me a way to automatically respond to something that is generated. So something that's generated most likely in a SIEM. It's another product that I'm going to perform automated information gathering. I'm going to ask additional questions before I make my decision. And then I also can automate that decision. And this would be something like, so say if I tie some of these together, so a SIEM generates an incident based on a threat to an identity that exists in Azure Active Directory or Okta or any of these other identity-based products. SOAR can then ask additional questions about what the state of that user is, and then based on the information that it gets back, it could actually provide a response, automatically blocking that user from signing in, automatically resetting that user's password, things of that nature. That's going to be kind of the automated response portions there. All right, and I hit heavy on the word product there for those first three: an EDR product, a SIEM product, a SOAR product. XDR, as it's defined, is a little bit more gray. So XDR is more of a holistic security solution. It's usually going to be a combination of a bunch of products together that can interact with one another. And at the very beginning, when the acronym XDR came out, we kind of thought about, so we love EDR. EDR is the ability to detect bad things on my endpoints, provide additional analytics, and respond. And it's kind of just one package. What if we could extend the concept of EDR everywhere, into different cloud environments, into different identities, into all across my entire stack? That was really the concept of what XDR wanted to be. And that's why it has to be a bunch of different products that are kind of interacting with one another, because there is not one product that can interface with the entire world of your technology stack. From there, if you take a look at the Microsoft XDR solution, this is kind of how we have it pictured. So on the left-hand side, we have a corporate headquarters on premise. We're protecting that with Defender for Endpoint primarily, with those endpoints. You want to manage those machines. You're going to interact with Microsoft Intune, Microsoft Endpoint Manager, things of that nature. And then there's always going to be some other third-party security product suite in there. I have Palo Alto firewalls, I have FortiGate firewalls, I have on-premise DLP solutions, I have anything of that nature. Third-party security products are going to always live out there as well. And then if I skip the middle, I go to the right-hand side. How does the cloud look then? I'm securing my cloud environments using, once again, in the Microsoft stack, it's going to be Defender for Cloud, which gives me a lot of the cloud security posture management, reaching into the different environments, giving me things like SecureSky, giving me best practice recommendations, performing detection. Purview and the information protection and data loss prevention kind of being more of my compliance based. I'm looking at sensitive data. I want to know where my sensitive data lives. I want to provide rules around how that information can be checked out if need be, things of that nature. And then last but not least, in cloud, Defender for Cloud Apps gives me my Cloud Access Security Broker, which is going to allow me to provide rules for how identities or users can access other cloud instances. So I'm actually going to have some level of control around what a user can do. All right. Then in the middle, we interact with Azure Active Directory being my identity stack. So that's going to be where all of my identities live in the cloud. Defender for O365 being my secure email gateway, and then Azure Logic Apps being my SOAR. So Azure Sentinel is going to sit on top of that Azure Log Analytics workspace. And that's going to be where all the data consolidates to. And then I basically just have a bunch of different modules that interact with that central piece. So you think about, Sentinel being my centralized point that all of my data from all of the different pieces are going to aggregate together so that I can actually provide, that automated response and everything like that. So if we look at this from a little bit different aspect, and now I'm going to start talking about market. The red box is where Microsoft has made a splash in the security market space. So that being primarily Forrester and Gartner, where we're talking about the market space. So Defender for Endpoint, Microsoft Intune for device management, the Azure Sentinel SIEM, Azure Active Directory for identities, Defender for 365 for my secure email gateway, Defender for Cloud Ops as my CASB. And then if you kind of take a look at this entire suite of products being the XDR solution, it is also even recognized within the marketplace. So where do they live? So if we evaluate the latest on Forrester first, we talk about the extended detection and response providers. Microsoft is, among the leader in the leaders wave, and then the endpoint detection and response. It's once again amongst the leaders in the leaders wave, and then security analytics platform. It just kind of crept into the leaders wave. So we know one of the main analyst here at Forrester that does these sorts of reports. He worked with us for a long time, and just from being, also interviewed as being, we were actually in the MSSP wave and quadrants. A couple of us here at SecureSky when that was still a thing. Gartner and Forrester each have different perspectives on what they're trying to look for when they release these reports. So Forrester has a different release cycle per report that we are going to be looking at just based on here. So security analytics, these are all the latest reports. Security analytics hasn't released another one since Q4 of 2020. So that's a little bit on a slower path of release. But then XDR, Q4 of 2021 was the first one. There's not been one since yet. It hasn't even been a year since that report's come out yet. But that's the first report that's come out of that nature. But then EDR, the EDR market is moving so fast that Forrester's actually releasing them pretty much on a quarterly basis. So you can see here, this is Q2 of 2022. This is brand new, right? So when we talk about kind of the hype cycle and where these things are existing and how the market is evaluating their ability, not just their ability to make an impact with their current offering, but how are they going to evolve this? What's their roadmap look like? And that's where you can see kind of the major axes that they move on. So Forrester releases these based on how they see the market evolving and the need evolving. If I then compare that to the Gartner Magic Quadrants, so Gartner Magic Quadrant, once again, endpoint protection platforms, Microsoft is the leader among leaders, access management leader as well. And then in the SIEM space, you can see that it's a visionary. So talking a little about the Gartner ones, these reports are released on an annual basis. And so endpoint protection and access management, we're talking end of 2021 when those were released into 2022. And then SIEM was actually summer of 2021 that it was released. You'll see like a report date of April there. Something about that. So when you take a look at, once again, the interviewing and the process for Gartner, then, the difference in that cycle of release, Gartner basically goes through and they have a bunch of qualifying statistics that they look for. You have to have X number of releases. You have to have a certain presence in the market, and you have to be capable of certain things in order to be classified within that space. I was beneficial enough, I suppose, to have been part of the interviewing stack when we were in the MSSP space. And so they basically go through, they ask you a whole bunch of questions, you fill out a bunch of reports, and then they go through and they interview you to clarify anything on that nature, and then you also demo your product. The report release, actually, though, basically they take all of their information and then they take at least a quarter to release, and then they give all of those vendors a certain amount of time to respond to the report, to make any sort of changes, and then they release it. So the SIEM report for last year was as of April 2021. It actually wasn't released, I don't think, until about June, though. And I'm bringing that up because we are right on the cusp of seeing a new SIEM report. One of the interesting things that we think we'll see is we do believe that Microsoft is going to move up in there. It'll be interesting to see if Gartner allows them to move that far in 1 year. But once again, the thing that'll be interesting here is if they're not going to be a leader this year, they'll be right on the cusp, we believe. And then the other thing is we're actually still evaluating configuration, content, and how the product even worked from probably closer to end of last year, than we are actually evaluating what it looks like today. All right, so let's talk a little about that market impact then. So Microsoft is making a splash, not just with Gartner and Forrester, but all over the place, right? So a lot of the objects, a lot of the things you'll see Microsoft talking about these days, they analyze a ton of data. They analyze over 7 trillion global threat signals daily, and that's going to be with how they kind of anonymize some of the data that they're seeing from their customers, how they are also using, they drink their own champagne. They're actually using all of these products themselves as well. So you'll see things about Microsoft releasing blog posts and white papers about how their threat intelligence centers are interacting with their operational units, and how it's basically saving time, saving money, and everything of that nature as well. They're also, Microsoft back in the day, you think about 20 years ago, they were they were the cause of a lot of the problems, right? They had just insecure operating systems. They were a company that you bought security products to help combat what Microsoft was doing in an environment because it was just a necessity to operate. Now Microsoft really is among the top security companies. Their security space, that segment is the fastest growing segment of any of the Microsoft business space, and they with $15 billion annually, and they've committed to investing over $20 billion into security just over the next few years. And Sentinel is absolutely going to be one of the key components of their security investment. I know, Mark, you had a couple things you wanted to add on here as well.
And I'm an
I think Mark's having some microphone issues.
Okay. All right, no issues, no problem. All right, so I'm going to change gears now. I talked a lot about market. I talked a lot about kind of more of the ethereal. So let's get into some of the technical stuff. So this is an overview of how Sentinel looks under the covers. So Sentinel, like I said, sits on top of a log analytics workspace. That's what lives right in the middle there. You can kind of see that anything that you can get into a log analytics workspace is capable of Sentinel analytics. When it comes to the other pieces of analysis, you have the ability to loan that data out to machine learning service workspaces for more of the fuzzy anomaly based detection that you might want to do based on your data. And even some of the visualization is really just lent from other products that Microsoft has, right? So you're using things like Power BI to interact with your data. You have the ability to use Azure Notebooks, which is the Microsoft's deployment of the open source Jupyter Notebooks, for any sort of other machine learning that you might want to do. A couple of the key components within here, like I'd mentioned, when you're doing any sort of integrations for response, you're really just going to be calling out logic apps. That's what that SOAR component is. So if you can build a logic app to do something, that logic app is going to be called by Sentinel to perform whatever response you need. You also have some ability to integrate with that log analytics workspace. If it's more of an indirect manner, you can do Azure functions to pull data in or to respond, or you can use event hubs. So a lot of that major Microsoft stack that lives in Azure, they've really built it in a way that Sentinel just interacts with all of those components. And this goes all the way down to the log and event sources. So if you, once again, peel back the covers, you take a look at some of the on-premise data sources. The AMA, the Azure Monitor Agent, is in the newer agent that Microsoft is deploying to collect data from on-premise. But even the old MMA, the Microsoft Monitoring Agent, depending on how long you've been in the space, if you remember, like Microsoft Operations Manager, the MOM agent for collecting data and telemetry, it's really just a rebranding of that. So it's really using a lot of the tried and true products that they've had over the years to integrate with just a new security platform instead. And so if you kind of try to take that and turn it into the major functions for how Sentinel works, this is that look. And this is really just the table stakes of what you would expect to see in a SIEM, right? So I have the ability to pull data into a table. I have a lot of ways to investigate and manage my incidents. I have saved queries and saved searches to be able to search through my data on a recurring basis a lot easier. A couple of the key things that Microsoft has adopted are frameworks like the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So being able to understand in an incident where a threat is in that kill chain, and then being able to understand where it came from, and then be able to hopefully predict where it's going, which should help you in the investigation and especially the response process then. So this is kind of just bubbling down that Sentinel overview to a lot of the major functions that you'd expect to see or that do live in Sentinel. So as we were adopting a new SIEM, so back at our previous MSSP, we had built our own SIEM, and when we started SecureSky, we thought there's no way that we want to do that again. So if we actually were to adopt our own a SIEM for us to use and for us to use with our customers, what did we want it to look like? What would we have as our requirements? And this is kind of how we bubbled them up, very, very high level. So we wanted it to be a cloud native. That was absolutely a requirement, with the ability to scale, quote unquote, infinitely. So we really wanted it to be able to scale at the need of the customer. We didn't want to have hardware pinning. We didn't want to have anything be on premise that I have to go and buy more hardware or more hard drive space for more data or more search heads or more indexers or all of those other concepts that you'll see in a lot of the legacy on-premise deployments. We wanted to be able to easily get insights into activity. A lot of it previously was being able to just search, right? You have to build a query and search for something, search for different pieces of information to help give you insight into what's happening. So we wanted to see, has this SIEM space matured to the point now that I actually have the ability to have some of that fed to me? It should know what the common questions are and be able to answer those common questions readily. With the questions piece also came data enrichment. So I didn't just want to know something at face value. I wanted to see what other pieces and parts of data could we actually pull in from a contextual perspective. If we see a threat against an endpoint, how easy is it to pull in the vulnerability and patch data for that machine? If it is an attack against an identity, how easy is it to pull in the context of that identity to know where that user is, what rights that user has within the environment? That way I don't need to go to another screen, to another portal, or anything like that to find it. I have that information readily available. use case and the machine learning analytics really being able to understand, is the activity according to what the profile and what the standard activity of that user is? Can I actually just see, this user normally accesses these SharePoint sites, downloads these sorts of files, and this is absolutely anomalous according to what that previous profile looked like. And then we really wanted a complete suite for operational functionality. We really wanted to be able to kind of fit this how it made sense, where it made sense, especially for our customers. If it's a small shop that has a single instance, we wanted it to be, to be able to fit that user or that customer. If we had a large entity that was international and had, multiple regional deployments, we still wanted it to be easier to at least reach across some of those to access the data, to be able to query when we needed to, but some data sovereignty requirements still had to have it, live at least somewhat segregated. And then the playbooks and interactive automation, especially coming from where we had a bunch of SOCs all over the world. The tier 1 responders, the tier 1 analysts were really just designed that their roles were really to do the most common 5 things. And it was look at these 3 things and then make a decision to block that user. Look at these 5 things and then make the decision to shun that IP address on the firewall. And all of that overhead from a manpower perspective was something that we wanted to really analyze to see, could this be automated? Could we actually, build the necessary steps in logic apps in the SOAR playbooks to get enough information to actually have a lot of that tier 1 be replaced with automation? Move the tier 1 up to tier 2 and 3, where they're actually helping tune what that looks like. That way, they don't have to necessarily go and hit all the buttons. They're more the ones that are actually interacting with the functionality. They're interacting with the product more from a management perspective than from a tier 1 interaction or response perspective.
So, can you hear me now, Brandon?
I can hear you now, Mark. Thanks for joining.
Okay. Yeah, reboot. But no, the big thing, and I always like to stress this to my customers, is about use case. Because a SIEM without use case is really, you're kind of lost, right? It's like policy. So one of the things really that's really cool about user entity behavior, I cannot count the number of customers that I've had that really want to look for RDP. And they're like, no, I need to detect all RDP. No, you don't. You really don't. And they're like, yes, I do. So I write a rule. And they're like, oh my God, no. And it's like, here's what you want to use. And it's really cool to show them because, you give UEBA enough time and it knows who's supposed to be RDP. And so it's a real cool rule to where you can actually create rules around that behavior analysis to really get the information you want. And that's a real cool feature about Sentinel, because now I can look for who's RDPing that normally doesn't. And that's a real good indicator of something might be different, right? And so that's kind of one thing I stress to people. There's also another cool use case about everybody wondering who's an admin user. You can actually use behavior analysis to find that out. You can use that table to actually look, show me all my admin users, instead of trying to figure it out and populate a watch list with it. So it really does have a lot of use for designing use cases, which makes things a lot easier for the end user. It's just something I like to point out to people because it's a really cool feature. And a lot of people I've seen don't even know they need to configure it. They don't know that they have to go hook up the data sources to it to be able to see all that information. So it's just really simple to set up.
Thanks, Mark. And that is a good point. And I would even say that's not just with Sentinel. The use case piece, a lot of people say, well, I need a SIEM because I need a SIEM. But what we have found with interacting with customers is that you know, if you say I need a SIEM just because I need a SIEM, and there aren't use cases that are met, we found that it winds up being it stood up and then it's just okay. Well, now what, right? So now it's stood up, and who's going to care and feed for it? Who's going to keep it keep the rules tuned? Who's going to go through and perform the incident response? Who's going to go through and roll out new features as they become available? Things of that nature. So you're absolutely right. The use cases help drive success in a lot of cases because you're actually seeing what success criteria look like, and you're marking it then as a successful project because you've actually been able to mark you've been able to complete the items on the list.
Yeah, I had a customer who had one that actually it was an audit issue. So they got a SIM, sat there for a year, and nobody ever touched it.
Yep. Yep. So I added another screen here, and this is more looking at how Sentinel rolled out. So in this grand scheme of things, the market reports, the Forrester Wave, the Gartner Magic Quadrant, SIEM reports have existed for a long, long, long time, and Microsoft came into this space in comparison not very long ago, and so I was impressed to see that the first time they actually threw their hat in the ring to be evaluated as a SIEM, they hit in the Visionary where they did. Um, Now, when you take a look though at the release of a SIEM like that, the first thing that Microsoft had to do was really evaluate what are the bare necessities that a SIEM has to do, and they had that list of things. And that was really their entrance into the SIEM space. From there, what we see now is they've done SIEM parity, so they are up and running. They have the data connectors that you would expect to see. They have the major modules that you would expect to see in a SIEM. And now what they're doing is there's two major steps to their functionality. The first is they really want to roll out additional use. They want to roll out something that is new, whiz bang, something that is going to try to make a splash from a functionality for either the security architect, the security operator, the security manager. From there, it winds up being, now that we have this, or especially as they go through a wave and there's potentially multiple teams that are working on it, you'll see a bunch of kind of, I'll call it spidering out, where there's additional functionality that kind of lives on its own. And then after, 3, 4, 5 of these new features are rolled out, then it kind of comes together into a package that becomes more ease of use. And so things of that nature would be, and actually once again, time permitting, I'll demo here. It's going to be the ability to extend archival of data. So the first thing that you had was you had the ability to just store hot, and then you had to build something to query the data on a recurring basis to dump it into something like Azure Storage. That was something like a logic app that you were going to build that would query that data and dump it out. And then Microsoft came out with the ability to just do a data export out of that log analytics workspace. And then they came up with the idea, well, if I have these, how can I make it a little bit easier? Well, let's build an API that's actually part of Sentinel that allows me to interact with this and say what data sources should be archived and what that extension of archive could be. And now it's all just a dashboard. It's an interactive dashboard that you just go to and you say, I want this much data. I want this much of it to be online. I want this much of it to be archived. And then if I have to rehydrate or restore that, it's all part of just a different page. So that's kind of the evolution that we tend to see is the functionality lives, and in very typical engineer fashion, it gets built by an engineer with engineer mindset of how can I make this cool, and then it's just, well, you have to do all of these complicated steps. Okay, now from a user perspective, how do I make that a lot easier to do? All right. I'm going to try to save about 10 minutes here, so I'm going to get through as much of, I've got 3 major features of the demo that I wanted to cover with you guys. This is really just what we feel are some of the major differentiators in Sentinel. There's obviously a whole bunch of features here, and If you haven't gotten it yet in these 40 minutes, I could talk for days. So I'm just going to save it for about 8 minutes, I promise. So if you can see my screen, this is just the main page of Sentinel. So we're in a Sentinel instance. We have that main dashboard that just shows you some of the just high level information. What's my overall log volume? What threats am I seeing from a malicious IP address or user perspective? What are my incidents? What are my anomalies? Just very, very high level there. Some of the pieces that I want to make sure that I called out though, first off, asking the questions. What questions should I ask? How can I visualize an incident rather than just needing to look through raw data, raw logs? So if I have an incident, and like I have in my screen, this is actually an incident that is made up of multiple alerts that live together. So in this case, I can select any of my incidents. I get a whole bunch of the additional context that I'm referring to here. In this case, I have an Office 365, Defender Pro 365 alert that came across that was an email message containing malicious data, or malicious attachment, I'm sorry. This was an informational alert. Some of the nuances that you can see that they did just by the color schema. So an informational alert being gray. I have another alert that ties to the same email address. And you can kind of see that relationship here. This was a low priority alert though. And so this was detected as phishing activity. And then I have another one that actually came across, once again, the same user as the malicious email and the phishing attempt. And these are from a time perspective within a couple of minutes of each other. And then I have a spike in failed logins from that same identity. So in this case, I can see kind of how it strings together. The colors also even match and tell me how the attack may have progressed from a priority perspective. But then what are the common questions that I might want to ask here? Well, I have an identity, I have a user. Who is that? So I have the groups that this user is part of. I have the roles that this user is. So I know in this case that in Azure Active Directory, this user is a global administrator. That gives me a whole lot more heartburn than if this user was not, right? So I just immediately know I don't have to go anywhere else. I don't have to ask any other questions, go any other portals or anything like that. It's readily available from the user and entity analysis module that Microsoft has or Sentinel has that's just plugged into Azure AD. A couple of cool things with this, I could just start readily asking other questions. So I can say what other alerts exist for this user. Where is this user, usually logging in from? And these all wind up being just additional pieces to, it's kind of has like a mind map feel to me. So it's additional pieces that just get added to the mind map for you. And then from there, you can just keep on building this out. So I have, are there any other Office accounts? So in this case, I have this IP address winds up getting a bunch of different users that are attempting to log in. It also happens to be one of our Office IP addresses, but that's kind of how you can see the relationship here. And this exists throughout every single entity and entity type. When you have incidents in Sentinel, all of these entities wind up being a specific type. And depending on the type, you can ask different questions of them, all the way down to if you're actually interacting with like a URL type, the context add winds up being, was this redirected? Is this a malicious site? You'll get screenshots of how it was simulated because Sentinel will actually just go through and simulate that entire piece. So it'll actually go through and it'll actually show you all of that info. So it's kind of once again, rather than your typical, I'm just going through and I'm reading raw logs. I'm trying to query or search through a bunch of raw logs to stitch together what happened. And even in some other Microsoft products, they do that as well, right? You think about interacting with Defender for Endpoint or those, it's just a timeline of events that you're searching through. Whereas now I have more of a graphical representation. I can see some of the relationships. All right, I'm going to completely switch gears. I'm going to talk about that interactive piece that I'd mentioned before, where I only have to go into Sentinel. So this is actually way, way, way under the covers logic app. So I have an incident that generated, and I want to just have it send it to me in Teams, and I want to be able to respond to it right in Teams. So I have an incident that generates, so we just kind of walk through this. I get the account information from that incident, and then I pass it through Azure Active Directory to say, is this user considered a risky user in Azure AD? I then compose and send an informational card to Teams, and then I wait. And I wait for a response based on what we actually want to do with it. And so that's what it looks like under the covers. But on top, this is what you would actually get. So in this case, I have an incident that generated. I have the ability to just click the link and look at the incident. I've extracted all of the major information around that user out of Azure AD. And then I have the ability to respond in Sentinel. I have the ability to respond in the identity protection platform within Azure AD. I can confirm the user is compromised. It'll go and send that to the identity protection blade in Azure AD, or I can interact with Sentinel directly. I don't have to go to the Azure portal. I don't have to go to hop into Sentinel and try to find anything else. If this is enough information for me to make my decision, I can make my decision right here, right now. All right. The last piece that I'll talk about from just a function perspective before I open up for questions is I'm going to change gears and I'm going to talk about cost. We get into a lot of engagements with customers where they are hesitant because of cost. They want to know more about what the cost is. You know, I have a perpetual license with Splunk, and I just know what my maintenance fees are going to cost. So how can this or how will this save me money? You know, things of that nature. So Sentinel is 100% consumption based. You pay by the gig that you ingest, you pay by the gig that you keep. So with that being said, like I mentioned before, I previously had to run PowerShell. I previously had to interact via APIs or do a whole bunch of different things to be able to see how my overall configuration was for ingest and retention. This is actually now the new archival mechanism. So there's just a dashboard that you call out that you say, here's the tables that exist within your Sentinel deployment. If you actually want to do some estimates, if you're on an enterprise agreement, you might have different pricing with Microsoft for Sentinel, but generally speaking, this is about the cost. It's about $4 to $4.30 for that ingestion price per gig. But you can update that and it'll start giving you some output for what the estimated cost is going to be if you actually were to keep it in Sentinel. And then you just go through and you say, okay, I have security events. These are my Windows logs. I want to keep those Windows logs interactive as hot data in Sentinel. Archive is rolling it off into Archive. So I want to have 730 days, or I want to have, it's 365 days, or I want to have 7 years. There's some requirements for compliance for 7 years. You can update that, and basically on a per table basis, you can then say, this is how long I want to keep that data. It updates it on the back end. It then starts archiving it off accordingly by subtracting the total retention from the interactive retention, and then you know how much archive retention you're going to wind up having. And then should you need to re-access it, it's just within the search page here. So I can restore my data. I can just hit restore. I choose the table that I want to restore from, the time frame that I want to restore, and then it basically just, they call it rehydration. It rehydrates it, puts it back as this temporary table that you can just query. So if I now want to hit this, I just basically query this as my table instead, and I can look through exactly as if it were fresh data. It is hot again. I can search back through it. I can join tables, and it is there until I delete it. So it's kind of also like an immutable block of data that is now going to live out there for whatever reason you have until you choose that it doesn't need to be there anymore. All right, I got as close to 11:50 as I could to keep about 10 minutes on to here. I thank you guys all for your time here today. We will absolutely open it up. If there's any questions, send them via chat, go off of mute, and feel free to fire away.
Hey, Brandon, it's Gina. I don't see any in the chat at the moment, but we did receive a couple via email.
Okay.
One of them was, are there any Office 365 licensing requirements to set up Sentinel?
Great question. No, there are not any requirements for O365 to get Sentinel in. There is a requirement to get the Azure Active Directory data in. You have to be Azure AD Premium P1 at least, which does kind of tie into a specific O365. I think it's E3 or Business Premium in order to get those in. But the O365 data itself, not only does the O365 online modules ingest with no requirement, they actually ingest into Sentinel at no cost as well. So you do not have to pay the $430. You do not have to pay for the flat 90 days of retention that's built in. But O365 data, as long as you live within those restraints, has no cost to you. As you move into higher license levels, you'll also start to see price breaks. I would recommend looking at the Microsoft documentation, but the last that I looked at it, Microsoft also was pushing, if you were a full M365 E5 shop, a lot of the additional security data from like Defender for Endpoint and all of those other modules also ingested at no cost within Sentinel.
Super helpful. Thank you very much. I will be sure to email them those details. And then the second one was from somebody who is on it. It is asking what lots from Defender are not free.
So it kind of like kind of feeding off of that last comment. So it does depend on your license level. Like I said, an M365 E5 shop last I read that Defender for Endpoint data ingested for free, alerts from any of the Defender products ingest for free, but the evidence data does not. So you think about it kind of as if I have an incident that generates in my Defender for O365 or Defender for Cloud, even if I were to reach into Azure as well, those incidents are not only they ingest for free, they're also bidirectional. So if you enable the bidirectional sync, you can say turn, if I close an incident in one, it'll also close the incident in that home product. But the evidence data, so if you need to pull in the email details that are part of that Defender for 365 alert, that does not ingest for free. It is it's a nominal fee. There's not a bunch of log data that gets put into there as well, but there is obviously the ingest cost associated with it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Now, I guess if anybody else wanted to unmute and ask any questions, or you can ask in the chat, now is your chance.
And just to add to what Brandon stated, and I don't have the list in front of me, but Microsoft actually publishes a list for like Defender of the events that are not free for ingestion. There's actually things like device info, network info, those types of, and those are things that can be configured in Sentinel in that connector for Defender for Endpoint, that you can say, I want these logs. And they tell you it's not free, but all of them are listed in the Sentinel connector for Defender for Endpoint.
Thanks, Mark. It looks like we do not have any additional questions. So we just wanted to thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Mark, Brandon, and Stan for presenting. We will send a recording tomorrow morning. There will be a link in the chat after the session ends, but you will not be able to access it. So just keep an eye on your emails for tomorrow morning. And that's it. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Great job, Brandon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.